Hello, and welcome to the second program in the series, Racism is a Public Health Issue, examining the impact of police brutality on Black communities in the age of COVID-19. I would like to begin by acknowledging our presence on the ancestry and unceded territory of the Gabrielino, Tongva, Chumash, and the Fernandeño Tataviam peoples, representing the indigenous groups in the area that comprises Los Angeles County. We pay our respects to the communities past and present. My name is Christine Y. Kim. I am a curator of contemporary art at LACMA and co-founder of Kyopo, both of whom are very pleased to co-present today's program with For Freedoms and SDA. Please follow these incredible organizations and the promising work that they are doing. I want to thank Michael Govan, Naima Keith, Rita Gonzalez, and LACMA for so readily and wholeheartedly agreeing to partner with these phenomenal organizations for our first talk in the Racism is a Public Health Issue series from May 7th that examined the rise of anti-Asian racism and xenophobia that has proliferated during the COVID-19 pandemic. It was our first attempt at unpacking racial inequities and prejudice at the intersection of the pandemic and art and culture in a public forum. After the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis on May 25th and ensuing Black Lives Matter protests, we quickly pivoted to focus on systemic racism and police violence against African Americans, which are hardwired into the fabric of this country, from its founding committed to capitalism, colonialism, and slavery to today, with BLM as the largest protest movement in US history, happening during the nation's most pervasive and destabilizing health pandemic, disproportionately ravaging Black, brown, immigrant, and marginalized communities since March, with no clear end in sight. 28% of people killed by the police in this country are Black, despite being only 13% of the population. Our screens and feeds are filled with the news and depictions of the brutalization of Black people at the hands of the police and the criminal justice system, exacerbating adverse chronic stress, higher rates of comorbidities, and lower life expectancy. Poet, scholar, and president of the Andrew Mellon Foundation, Elizabeth Alexander, recently wrote about how Black bodies in pain have been an American spectacle for centuries, from auction blocks, public whippings and rapes, to lynching, police beatings, and imprisonment. Blacks have not only been victims of racist violence, but, quote, in one way or another, Black people have also been looking, forging a traumatized collective historical memory, which is re-invoked at contemporary sites of conflict. Similarly, with this pandemic, African Americans are dying at a rate nearly twice their share of the population. Structural factors such as unemployment, lack of access to medical care and health insurance, and essential work and environmental exposures are the biggest drivers of infection and death. In the words of Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, director of the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center at American University, quote, "There's something about living through a deadly pandemic that cuts open the shell, removes the flesh, and finds the very core of American existence. The slaveholder clamoring for his freedom to infect, the enslaved clamoring for our freedom from infection," end quote. Tonight, we are joined by some of the most respected scholars of the current media, medical, and cultural landscapes. Our panelists will provide a framework for understanding race-related stress and trauma as it relates to primary source footage depicting Black suffering, which is circulated and weaponized, as well as the transformative and radical possibilities of cinema and contemporary art. I am honored and grateful to welcome our four esteemed scholars, practitioners, and cultural producers to our virtual stage, starting with Dr. Darnell Hunt, who will be our first speaker. Darnell Hunt is Dean of the Division of Social Sciences and Professor of Sociology and African American Studies at UCLA. Dr. Hunt has written extensively on race and media, including 4 books and numerous scholarly journal articles and popular magazine articles. Dr. Hunt has been a frequent public commentator on questions of media and race. Welcome, Dean Hunt. Dr. Erica Bath, MD, is board certified in child, adolescent, and adult forensic psychiatry. Dr. Bath studied at UC Berkeley, Howard University, and NYU School of Medicine, where she was faculty prior to joining UCLA. She is currently Associate Professor and Vice Chair for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion for the Department of Psychiatry at the Jane and Terry Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior in the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. Dr. Bath specializes in diagnostic assessment and forensic consultation with adolescents, with an emphasis on high-risk youth. She has a long-standing interest in healthcare disparities, minority and community mental health, with a particular interest in addiction and trauma within populations of juvenile justice and foster care youth. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Bath. Our third speaker today is Ava DuVernay. Winner of BAFTA, Peabody, and Emmy Awards, Academy Award nominee Ava DuVernay's directorial work includes the Oscar-winning civil rights drama Selma, the Oscar-nominated social justice documentary 13th, and the Disney children's adventure A Wrinkle in Time, which made her the highest-grossing Black woman director in American box office history. In 2019, she created, wrote, produced, and directed the Emmy Award-winning limited series When They See Us. She's currently producing the 5th season of her acclaimed series, Queen Sugar. Welcome, Ava DuVernay. And last but not least, born in Chicago in 1977, Rashid Johnson is a contemporary artist whose work explores themes of art history, individual and shared cultural identities, personal narratives, literature, philosophy, materiality, and critical history. After studying photography at the School of the Arts of Chicago, Johnson's practice quickly expanded to embrace a wide range of mediums, including sculpture, painting, drawing, filmmaking, and installation, yielding a complex multidisciplinary practice that incorporates diverse materials rich with symbolism and personal history. Welcome, Rashid. Each speaker will be spotlighted for 8 to 10 minutes, some engaging in dialogue with our moderator, my LACMA colleague, VP of Education and Public Programs, and also my fellow Studio Museum in Harlem alum, Naima J. Keith. She will then lead the panelists in a group discussion before opening it up to questions, at which time I will rejoin the group. Today, we welcome over 3,000 viewers, and I thank you all for joining. I hope you will continue to follow our work addressing racism as an ongoing public health crisis, with a third panel scheduled for the fall. But before I hand this off to Naima, we have a surprise special guest today. Supervisor Mark Ridley Thomas, Los Angeles County, 2nd District, would like to make an important announcement. Supervisor Thomas, thank you for joining us. I hand it off to you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, and it's a pleasure to acknowledge everyone and to give a shout out to this exceptional panel. I wanted to speak with you today because not since the civil rights movement itself have we seen such an extraordinary moment in time that has pushed us to rethink what it is we're doing and how we are doing it. And confronting the question of racism, particularly institutional racism, took a turn for the better today. And some ask the question, how is institutional racism manifesting itself in the context of governance, policy making, and service delivery? Well, it's simply not enough to talk about racism. We have to be about it and confront it. And that's what we seek to do. The issues we are dealing with are embedded in the culture of the county in some way, and I want to say that change requires change. There is no LACMA without the County of Los Angeles, the creation of the County of Los Angeles, and therefore we celebrate the fact that this conversation is taking place right now. So in this moment, those of us sit in positions of authority and responsibility have to engage in what I would like to characterize as dismantling systemic racism and bias from our respective vantage points. That's what we have to do. And so at today's board meeting, the supervisors unanimously adopted a motion that I put forth on developing an anti-racist policy framework for the County of Los Angeles. And I made the motion available to the panelists. It was a very profound moment. The County of Los Angeles is 150 plus years old, and this is the first time there has been a call for what can be described as an explicit undressing of institutional racism that confronts the question of equity head on and deals with what we need to do to make life what it ought to be for African Americans and other persons of color who know the history of discrimination. So it is my honor to just share these thoughts with you and to make sure that we understand that the arts matter as it relates to advancing the agenda for social change. So right now, in LA County, we have an opportunity, and we need you to help us push forward. It's not enough to celebrate the passing of the Reverend C.T. Vivian and Congressman John Lewis. We've got to be about the task of confronting the issues of racism on our terms in our day with the tools at our disposal. While the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice, it is the march that is inexorable that we have to be about. We've got to take it on. And I invite you all to partner with us, invite me to partner with you as we engage this fundamentally important issue so that we can, in fact, realize the promises of democracy. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Supervisor Ridley Thomas. The motion that just passed today, which includes concrete steps towards the formalization of an anti-racist police agenda, will go a long way towards establishing LA County as a leader in this area. So thank you so much. This is truly a historical moment. I will now launch into the conversation portion of this afternoon. So I'd like to call to the virtual stage, Darnell Hunt. Hi, Darnell, how are you?
Naima, how are you?
Good.
All right.
Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I know you're incredibly busy. So again, I just wanted to express our gratitude.
Well, I'm thrilled to be here, thrilled to be here.
So while this conversation is very much focused on the impact of police brutality on Black and Brown communities, particularly Black communities, we really can't think about this conversation and not think about the media, right? And we can't underestimate the impact of the media, especially when we think about films like Birth of a Nation, right? That
Sure.
debuted in 1915.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about, or can you give us a bit of historical context as to how a film like Birth of a Nation directly impacted how we see Black communities as criminals?
Sure. So I think the first thing we should note is that film, television, media, popular media, it's not just entertainment. Media images do matter in society. The diagram you're looking at here is what we refer to as the circuit of culture. It comes courtesy of scholars Stuart Hall and Paul Duguay, in a really important book they wrote called Representation. This particular book talks about the role of representation in culture, in society. And representation can be thought of as those images that we take for granted, those irresistible images when we think man, woman, Black, white, etc. What comes to mind? Those are representations. And the important takeaway here is that representations are embedded in media. They circulate through media, like films like Birth of a Nation. They influence our identity, who we are, who we aren't, who we hope to be. They influence the types of things we produce, what we consume. You know, advertising is all about selling images that we believe are attractive. And importantly, they influence regulation, what gets regulated in society, and the ways in which we draw boundaries around groups. And we can think of policing as an important part of that process. And the important point to take away here is that all of these different elements are related to one another and mutually influence one another in a cycle. A film like Birth of the Nation, which was released in 1915, at a really pivotal point in our history. We were coming out of Reconstruction. It was the height of Jim Crow. There were all kinds of backlashes to the progress that the country had hoped to make after the end of slavery. And so you had D.W. Griffith, who produced this racist film, basically, that glorified the KKK. It was sort of the first major Hollywood production in the sense that it introduced a lot of the techniques that we take for granted in modern filmmaking. It was wildly popular. It earned between $50 and $100 million, which was an amazing amount of money back then. President Woodrow Wilson showed it at the White House for foreign dignitaries. He said it was like history written in lightning. He himself, of course, was a racist sympathizer. And it really did echo what this country was all about in terms of race. It introduced and popularized a lot of stereotypes about African Americans: the mammy, the coon, the buck, the tom. And more importantly, it talked about the Black threat, the threat of the Black male body in particular, with Gus, one of the characters who was believed to have raped a white woman, which of course brought the KKK to the stage, which used this trope, to lynch Black Americans throughout the South, throughout America during this period. So it was a very profound film that left a mark. It's no accident that the NAACP, which was created shortly during this period, saw this as one of its first campaigns, as the NAACP was trying to move African Americans toward more integration into American society. They saw this film as a major problem because they knew that the image mattered, the representation mattered.
But speaking of representation and media, we know, obviously, fast forward from 1915, we do know that television news and TV media, I think, had a lot to do with kind of advancing the causes around the civil rights era, right?
Yeah.
That we know that Ralph David Abernathy and Martin Luther King Jr. and a number of others understood the power of television news.
Yeah.
On have one hand where there are images circulating all the time that are racist and obviously harmful, but then you also have the use of especially television news to explore the atrocities that are happening all throughout the country as it relates to the fight for civil rights. Can you talk about the role that media and TV played beyond that? I mean, this idea that it wasn't just enough to tell people that these things were happening, but really kind of using the press to their advantage.
Sure. So I think the takeaway here is, going back to this diagram, that media can cut both ways. They can be anti-racist, or they can promote a racist agenda. And the real question is, who controls the media, who uses the media, and how do we use it? So, during the civil rights movement, the modern civil rights movement, we had the confluence of two things. We had this amazing movement that was attempting to transform American society with respect to race, but we also had the rise of network television news. And network television news depended upon provocative images. And what more provocative image could you find other than what was happening in the South? Police dogs being sicked on protesters, water hoses, Bull Connor, all that imagery. And all of that was captured in network news. Now, Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy and others, they were very strategic about what they were doing. They realized that by making visible the brutality of Southern oppression, that they could start to change American attitude toward these things. So they actively strategized about how to use the media, when to use it, and to use it for cover. Realizing that they would be brutalized less if the cameras were present, as opposed to when the cameras weren't there. So a number of the pivotal moments during the civil rights movement, particularly in the 1960s, as network news was rising, like the march from Selma to Montgomery, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, that John Lewis led, God rest his soul. All of those things were captured, and a number of people point to those moments as turning points in American public opinion about the reality of race and the reality of racism.
So now we're at a point where video footage is, at a premium, right? That's something that we're consuming and seeing all the time. But can you talk about how video footage, and I'm particularly thinking as an LA girl myself, thinking about, as a kid, and I saw the beating of Rodney King.
Yeah.
And can you talk about the kind of the introduction, at least in my lifetime, the introduction of video footage? So from, Rodney King to now we have the killing of George Floyd, and just the, how we're seeing, via video footage, the interactions between Black people and, the police. So we have, Birth of a Nation, then we have, kind of using the power of media in the civil rights era, but still showing the atrocities. And now we have video footage that's being taken by everyone to show this interaction that we've long known about, but I think is being shown on an everyday basis. So can you talk about what that interaction, what that's done in terms of our understanding of?
I think that's the key point. The point that you made about the fact that video, particularly with the Rodney King beating in 1991, March of 1991, capturing on videotape in a very profound way for the first time, something that we had known for generations. It wasn't like a secret in Black and brown communities that police were brutalizing people. But here you had the George Holliday video that was hypermediated around the world. And everyone felt like, well, finally, we now had video proof of what we've been saying about the LAPD, about the California Highway Patrol, and we're finally going to get justice. And of course, what happened was they moved the trial to Simi Valley, a largely white jury, and they were able to use this narrative, this trope that was popularized in Birth of the Nation and everything since then about the threat of the Black male body, to argue that Rodney King was the aggressor. It wasn't the police officers, and they acquitted the officers. And we all know what happened after that. LA exploded into the 1992 LA uprisings. But from that moment, 1991, with the widespread availability of camcorders, now, of course, we have smartphones and everyone has a camera in their pocket. So we're seeing these things all over the country. So we have Eric Garner, we have Ahmaud Arbery, we have George Floyd. I mean, all of these different cases where now captured on video for everyone to see the naked brutality of what police have done is apparently beginning to have an impact. At least recent opinion polls are showing that more Americans now, on the heels of the protests, believe that Black people are discriminated against, that policing needs to change, that America has a race problem. In fact, I saw one survey that showed a doubling in the agreement with that position between 2008, when Barack Obama was first elected, and now. 59% of Americans, the majority of Americans, including whites, feeling this way. This is something that's new.
Yeah.
So, I'm a cautious optimist. With every step forward, we tend to take a few backwards, but media have a tremendous amount of power. The technology we have at our fingertips now has created a condition that we didn't really have before. And I believe to the degree that we can continue to use those media in the service of anti-racist campaigns, we have the potential at least to change America and to move it closer to its ideals.
But it's so interesting, I think, in this moment that there's so many different things happening in terms of media and how we see police being represented, both on film and TV, right? So we have on one level, video camera, everyday videos of different police interactions with Black people. Then we have, police on TV, on media, on film. But I'm particularly thinking about media because, a lot of us watch the news, the evening news. And I think what's so interesting is that oftentimes you see how a scene or a car accident or anything, right, is kind of told from a police perspective, right? So that oftentimes journalists will say, police reports or, it's often kind of mediated through the lens of a police officer. So can you talk about how, in our kind of final minutes before we kind of jump on and move on, but just to say that, can we talk about the role that Hollywood and media has played in terms of how we view some of these events?
Well, the first thing we have to realize is that Hollywood is a white male-dominated space. And I've been a critic of this for years. We do an annual Hollywood Diversity Report that documents from year to year how Hollywood is shifting. And we've seen some progress in recent years in front of the camera, but where we haven't seen a lot of change is in the executive suites, the people who have green lighting authority, who decide what gets made with what type of budget, that type of thing. And television tends to be a writer's medium in the sense that the showrunner sets the tone for the show. And crime procedurals, those Law and Order shows are very popular, particularly on CBS and a few other networks.
I watched
and they do tend to glorify the police. I did a study for Color of Change a couple of years ago called Race in the Writer's Room. And one of the things we wanted to understand was the degree to which the legitimacy of the criminal justice system was being affirmed as opposed to critiqued in these crime procedurals. And what we found is that Black people had very little influence in the creation of these procedurals. In fact, only one of the 9 procedurals that fell into our sample had a Black showrunner, and most of the shows had no Black writers, and a few had like one Black writer. So it was a space where you didn't have people who come from communities, who have experiences with police that differ from this glorified notion of the police, who actually had influence around the table when narratives were being written. And what you got as a result was everything told from the perspective of the police. And what we know about media, going back to that diagram I shared, is that when we tend to see things over and over again, and when we consume large sort of amounts of media, we tend to, over time, embrace the media framing of that thing. And the same is true for news. And news is very similar. I mean, if you look at most newsrooms, you don't have a lot of people of color in decision-making positions. And often reporters are told to go and get a particular story. And you go out and you get that story. It's framed before you go out there often. And that tends to be stories told from the perspective of the official, the official point of view, be it a government official or a police officer or whatever.
So I want to put a pin in this because I definitely want to segue and make sure that we talk to all the panelists, but just how gender and sexuality biases also kind of play into police brutality. So I'm putting a pin in that, and then we'll certainly come back. But now I'd like to bring to the virtual stage Dr. Erica Bath. Thank you, Darnell.
Thank you.
Hi, Erica. How are you?
Good. How are you, Naima?
Good. Thank you again for joining us this afternoon. So I know you have a few slides you'd like to share with us, so I will let you launch into your presentation.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. We are here today to dialogue on racism, public health, and police violence, and how it's making Black people sicker during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm going to kick us off with a quote by the president of the APA, Dr. Schulman, who called COVID-19's disproportionate and savage toll on Black and brown people by its name, racism. We are living in a racism pandemic. The health consequences are dire. Racism is taking a heavy psychological toll on Black and brown people, and the stress caused by racism contributes to the development of physical and mental health disorders. Racism is structural and systemic. That means it oozes and flows in every nook and cranny. Understanding that racism is systemic and operates in every system we have, from housing to health to education and employment, is the foundation for this dialogue. Racism is also central to our criminal justice and policing system. Central to racism is the structural and violent reinforcing of white supremacy through police power. Sadly, there is almost no illness where racism does not affect us. And that's the systemic nature of racism's effect on Black and brown bodies' health and well-being. Racism's relentless impact exists from womb to tomb. Whether we're talking about Black mothers' health or the health of their babies, prostate or breast cancer, or the disproportionate impact of criminalization on folks with mental illness, racism is here, there, and everywhere, and the primary driver of adverse health outcomes for Black and brown people. It's in the air we breathe for those allowed to breathe. But fundamental to the enforcement of racism is policing. And as Patrick Martinez notes, racism doesn't rest in a pandemic, especially when we consider policing and law enforcement. In order to fully appreciate the ways in which police violence is part and parcel of systemic racism, we need to look back. The Ghanaian symbol of the Sankofa bird is particularly relevant here. Sankofa asks us to go back and fetch it, go back and get it. And it reminds us that we cannot be ahistorical when we talk about police brutality and police violence. We need to anchor our understanding in the past. Slave patrols were the forerunner of modern American law enforcement. These were our earliest forms of policing, and they were, like now, government-sponsored forces that were brutal, organized, and enfranchised with impunity to kill Black and brown bodies in the service of white supremacy. As my colleagues at the UCLA Center for Racism, Health, and Social Justice stated so well, the root of American policing are slave patrols, and they functioned in the service of racial capitalism. Post-slavery and throughout Jim Crow, lynching and white mob violence were additional forms of state-sponsored racial terror and underscore the duality of the legal system today. It is why we have barbecue Beckys and Karens and white vigilantes who killed Trayvon Martin and Ahmaud Arbery. There are two justice systems. For white America, police equals safety, and for Black America, police equal threats to the mind, body, and soul of our communities. To this day, despite there being over 200 anti-lynching bills, not one has been passed, most recently blocked by Senator Rand Paul in June of 2020. The message to Black Americans has been and always has been clear. Values of white supremacy and structural racism are what rule this nation and will be enforced by any means necessary, whether inflicted by lynch mobs or federal agents in Portland, Oregon. Law enforcement, therefore, represents the physical might and muscle of systemic racism. They are the ammunition and armed militia and militarization of the police. Racism needs the structural violence and brutality imposed by law enforcement to maintain its chokehold on Black and brown American life. Thus, the timeline and the systemic nature of police violence can be traced from slave patrols through the school to prison pipeline. So we must name police brutality as the public health crisis it is. Police brutality is a leading cause of death for young men in the US. 1 out of every 1,000 Black men can expect to be killed by police in their lifetimes. And this constant sense of threat and siege has long-term effects on individual and population health. Police brutality is making Black people sick through a structured cycle at the individual and population level. Whether we are talking about fatal injuries, mass incarceration, fees and fines that disrupt financial stability, all of these factors collectively and singularly impact our brains, our nervous system, and result in negative health effects. Let's talk a minute about psychological stress. Each episode of police brutality creates wear and tear on the psyche. It's watching Amy Cooper in Central Park weaponize privilege. It's experiencing no-knock warrants and stop and frisk. And it's watching the thousands of deaths of Black bodies go unpunished for hundreds of years. The message that Black bodies are disposable and undeserving of justice takes a psychological toll. And in thinking about this toll, it's critical to be aware of what my colleague called racism pornography and its dangers. Voyeurism and salacious spectatorship of police violence and racial terror is bad for the brain. While seeing is believing, and we need to see and document to name and tell our truths and stories, the repetitive visualization of vigilantism, police lynchings, and dehumanization on Black bodies can cause moral injury and collective trauma. Repetitive visualization of injustice can bring about collective trauma, anger, grief, hopelessness, and fear. Gaslighting by society makes the collective response to trauma worse. It's the underreaction of colleagues in the face of injustice and the need to explain why silence is violence. It's the need for 2 autopsies for George Floyd. It's the lack of indictments, arrests, and convictions in thousands of cases. It's the push for Black folks to go about business as usual and keep on keeping on as if nothing has happened. The violence of silence causes harm on the collective consciousness of communities. The impact of violence on Black bodies is making us sick from wound to tomb. Even pregnant Black mothers report higher levels of stress due to the anticipatory anxiety of rearing children while Black. This is your brain on trauma. In a typically functioning brain, a scary event triggers a trauma response by the amygdala. The amygdala is the control tower in your brain that regulates response to threats. The perception of a threat causes a fight, flight, or freeze response, which is adaptive and necessary for survival. Our hippocampus, another area in the brain, creates a potent memory file of the event. But what happens when the threats become pervasive? When they are so nonstop and so omnipresent that you cannot walk while Black, drive while Black, sleep while Black, or do anything while Black. This causes an overtaxing of our nervous system and an excess release of chemicals that cause damage to our organs and result in chronic diseases. The overactivity of our stress response system results in varied dysfunction, as well as a hippocampus that's reduced in size, among other things. Trauma's impact on the brain takes up a lot of space. And for those with complex trauma, the time spent in survival mode takes up too much psychic space at the expense of other functions. There are many signs and symptoms of trauma that can erode emotional well-being and push people into maladaptive patterns of coping. This quote from Baldwin's essay, Stranger in the Village, highlights that our bodies embody history and thus the legacy of racial trauma. So it is key to understand that no one who witnesses violence and police brutality is unaffected by it. In the spirit of healing, I'd like to affirm Black excellence and call attention to the work of two important scholars who have written about how to approach healing our minds and bodies. Reshma Menachem names the phenomenon of racialized trauma as white body supremacy. His work shows us that trauma lives in our bodies from head to toe and is passed on from generation to generation. And in order to address trauma or white body supremacy, we need to center working on our bodies and its primal responses as part of the healing response. The work of Dr. Cheryl Grills highlights that part of the work is the urgency of emotional emancipation, or as Bob Marley said, emancipate yourself from mental slavery, none but ourselves can free our mind. This begins with rejecting the lie of Black inferiority, a root cause of racial injustice promulgated by the ideology of white supremacy, which has anti-Blackness at its core. And this is just to acknowledge and thank my colleagues and team of scholarly advisors. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erica. I can't wait to dig into some of the very important points you brought up during your presentation. And now I'd like to bring up to the virtual stage, Ava DuVernay. Hi, Ava. How are you?
I'm well. How are you? Good to
I'm
see you.
Good to see you. So I must admit, in preparation for this conversation, I decided to grab a glass of wine. Well, I put the kids to bed first, grab a glass of wine, and then watch a bit of When They See Us and 13th.
Mm.
That is not a double feature.
No, that's a brave thing to do back to back.
It took me down. I'm not gonna lie. I was crying. It was a whole thing. So, but it's just to say that, you know, it's especially with 13th, I think what made not only is obviously, as you know, obviously emotionally powerful film, but I think it just how resonant it feels today. Like it was almost scary just how it did not feel like this film was made a couple of years ago. It feels like you released it yesterday. I mean, some of the topics, some of the idea. I mean, it was just, and then I watched a subsequent interview with you and Oprah, and it's, again, just to kind of see some of the things that were brought up and just how present, I don't know, some of those topics it was just a little scary, I think, in a lot of ways. But, you know, how do you prepare, you know, to produce content like that? Because I know that there's hours and hours of footage on the cutting room floor. And what we see is, you know, years in the making. Can you talk about, you know, when you're kind of going through images of police brutality and you're seeing video footage and you're going through interview material, how do you prepare? How does your cast and crew prepare? Yeah, if you just walk us through that process.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for watching the work and for having me here. You know, I just believe before the image, it's the experience of making the image. And that's the privilege that I have as a filmmaker. And that's the privilege that everyone who's making the film with me has. You know, I always think of Kerry James Marshall and his whole idea about the narrative of mastery. It's so steeped in the idea of absence.
Yeah.
And when I think of all of the artists who came before me who were absent on these sets, whose stories were absent from the canon of, you know, the film canon. You know, I don't think of the work that I do as like anything I have to prepare for, or put on armor for. I think we are here. We have the privilege of making this. I try to, you know, offer a sense of that to everyone who's working with me, invite that feeling of we are the masters of this story. We are the tellers. And even though we're telling subject, you know, we're talking about subject matter that is intense and is violent, we get to tell it from our point of view. And that is an honor. And so every day on set, that is a sacred ground and sacred work that we're doing. That's my feeling about it. So that lifts me and makes some of the heavy images that we might be creating less heavy in their creation. You know, that's also a part of, you know, really handpicking the crew and who's making it with you, and making sure that every single fingerprint is from someone who's intentional and who's, you know, there in the right spirit. So all that together helps, you know, helps in the making. And And so it's not a depressing endeavor at all.
Yeah. But I think that, the benefit, I guess, of living and existing in this current moment is that we do have so many more examples of, police brutality being seen on film and handled by several different people, right? So you have everything from, Blackish to The Hate U Give to Atlanta to, and also your work as well. But we also have it being treated in so many different ways, right? So in some cases it's being held, it's being treated delicately. And then in other cases, maybe not so much. It's a bit more clumsy. Can you talk about, the sensitivity around Black trauma and how it's being considered? I mean, the fact that you have so many different people kind of taking on this material, and are those discussions kind of happening in your circle just about how this material is being treated?
I think you always look at projects that you may not be connected to and think, oh, that's interesting. But so everyone has the right to do whatever they want. I should be able to go, that's the purview of the artist. But the audience also has dominion over the work, and that's in the way that we regard it, and the way that we're interpreting the intention and the end product. And so for me, I get less concerned with who's doing what, because I'm focusing on what I'm doing.
Yeah.
I'm applauding and sharing the things that I feel work for me, and not really bothering too much with the other stuff. But as you think about Black trauma and the way that that's being depicted, it's challenging to see it handled in ways that are not that lack nuance and clarity and understanding. But that's the story of this country, so it's not a surprise.
Yeah. One of the things I noticed in 13th, for example, is how you made sure to include that the footage was, I don't want to say blessed because you didn't use that word, but just you were given permission to show certain footage from the families of these victims. Can you talk about what responsibility filmmakers owe to just real life victims of police brutality? Like the idea that you intentionally made sure that we knew that the family was okay with you showing this work. So can you talk about, what responsibility, not just you have, but I think just filmmakers in general, I think have to not just the material itself, but also kind of depicting these very sensitive topics in, I think, responsible ways?
I grapple with the word responsibility because, artists are human beings, and I just think it's important to treat people the way you'd like to be treated. So, if I imagine, the horror of having a loved one, murdered, and to see that on camera, and to think that just because that's public domain, that someone might actually be able to take that, and whether it's a news station or a filmmaker, show it and use it in any way they want, that is a violation of monumental proportions. And so just as a human being, that was not right to me. It was actually my sister, who's a deputy manager of memorial and museum relations at EJI, at Bryan Stevenson. I said, can you work with me to call these people, call these women? And she sat on the phone with the mothers and the sisters. Wow. And, really went through that process of listening to folks. And there were some people who didn't want it used.
I was going to ask you if you got
many.
Yeah.
And then there were others who said, use it, people should bear witness to what happened. And so we respected that on both sides, whether it's the Central Park Five, whether it's, it's the King family, and I'm dealing with material that's based on real people's lives. I don't take it as an artist's responsibility. I take it as like, be a decent human being and think about what if this was you? And so that's how I go about it. And I try not to, cast any kind of, weight or demand on any other artist, because everyone's different. I would hope that more people practice that kind of, some ethical practice in the use of the images, though.
Well, it's just interesting, and sorry to veer off the questions a little bit, but just to say that, after the killing of George Floyd, my husband and I were watching CNN, and the two, the Black man that owned the restaurant where you have the best view of the killing of George Floyd was on CNN and kind of talking about how he really wrestled with whether or not to release that material, right? But he felt very strongly about the fact that he should release it because he didn't want it to be mediated. Like he didn't want the FBI to kind of come in and say, no, you can't release the material and blah, blah. So it's just kind of on one level, these images in this video is pretty much the only kind of evidence, right, that we have that these atrocities exist, except that seeing it over and over and over again has such an impact, I think, of how we're seeing ourselves on TV. And so can you talk about, like, as you're literally dealing with this material in a lot of your work all the time. And so I know we talked about how you kind of, come to that work, but just kind of talking about, the power, I guess, of video content. It kind of leads me to think about your new projects as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think when you really think about that term, your mind's eye, it's really this internal camera. It's the images that we consume. It's not necessarily just in a film context. They can either nourish or malnourish you. They become a part of your DNA. They become a part of your mind and your memory. And, the images, the more, dense they are, the more they kind of get stuck in the way that we process things. And so, for me as a filmmaker, I'm able to control the image. I'm able to shape it in a way where, a certain intention might make its way through. These videos that we've seen of the murders of Black people at the hands of police are stories being told in the most chaotic of situations, but they are, in many instances, I regard them as the last voice of the people who can no longer speak. See my story, see what has happened to me. And in that way, although traumatic in its watching, we're able to process it in a different way based on, our intention in watching. If you're watching it as trauma porn, if you're watching it as lament, then it has one effect. But as I watch it, I try to watch it and bear witness. I try to be the person who's standing there, the person who, is able to be with them in moments where they might have been alone. You imagine all of our ancestors hung from trees in the dark in the middle of nowhere. Someone just to see what is happening to me. And that is the way that I regard these images. And it's not for everyone. Right. But for me, the intention with which I watch really, changes my chemistry around it. And it feels like, to me, a sacred experience. It is, to be able to, participate in the transition of life, even in the most violent situations, to say you're not alone in this. And I could, it makes me emotional to think about it, but I would just invite people, for some people it's too much. But I would invite people to try to think of it differently, because those images can propel us to places where we, are able to be fortified, where we're able to be instigated into action. They can inform us, they can educate us, they can prepare us. I think they have value if the families have given permission.
Can you talk about, as we close this portion, can you talk about your decision recently to tweet a video of a young man in Texas? I think it was a short video, which basically is just the idea that you were working on a project and you were kind of asking, like, oh Lord Jesus, did I not read the tweet correctly? But that's what
you did.
No, but anyway, so I was just saying that, you recently tweeted this video of a young young Black man in Texas who was lying on the ground. He was terrified. He was in tears. And, police stood over him with guns. And I think it was so powerful. And I want to say that it was allegedly because he ran a stop sign. So we're just, going to give you context for why he was pulled over. But you asked your followers to identify the police officers in the video for a new project. And I thought that was extremely powerful because obviously you have a huge following on Twitter. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us about that new project and what it means? I've noticed that people have started to really call out the names of the police officers that have been involved in these deadly shootings.
And it was for that very reason. Every time that there's a police incident, a story is told. A story is constructed in the press. A story begins to be constructed the minute that the officer is on the scene and fills out the police report. We can see in the case of Breonna Taylor, her police report was empty. There was nothing on the lines. They said that nothing had happened. But if the sister was able to tell the story, she'd say they shot me in my bed and let me bleed out. And so, but the official story is what the police put on paper. And so often the, police officers are allowed to have the final word. If there's not a video, we go with what they say, and they are able to, disappear behind this blue wall of silence and kind of just go on with life while we, give eulogies for our loved ones, our people. And so the idea that we've been trained as a society not to know their names,
Yeah.
to just know their names. I invite people to pull up a couple of articles on Breonna Taylor, on, we know the names of all the folks who passed, on Freddie Gray. You have to go about 5 paragraphs down if you're lucky to get to the name of the officer,
Yeah.
right? You'll be watching CNN and they'll talk about an incident. They'll say the name of the victim and never the officer. This is a national blind spot. And this allows law enforcement to be unaccountable. We know that police unions don't hold them accountable. We know the statistics about, courts of law not holding them accountable, but the people can hold them accountable. We pay their salaries. They are there to protect and serve us. And the very minimum is to at least be able to call out their names and say, we see you, we know you, we don't approve. So we started this thing called LEAP, the Law Enforcement Accountability Project. It's at leapaction.org. And we are funding projects about officers, to make sure that their names are amplified. And these are not about the good cops, because there are a lot of good cops. Somebody broke in here right now, I'd be calling the cops. I'd hope it was a good one, though. I'd hope it was someone who believed I lived here.
Yeah.
It was someone who would be as concerned for my well-being as their own. And so these are the kinds of conversations that we're hoping that we can have. And I think artists, can be at the forefront of that in a lot of ways.
Thank you so much, Ava. We'll be back. And on that note, I would love to bring up Rashid Johnson. Hi, Rashid. How are you?
Well,
Good. So we're going to jump into a few questions. We're going to see a few images. I'm, of course, going to compliment you on the Sam Gilliam in the background before we start, because I'm a huge fan. But, I think it was really important, to have you be a part of this conversation, because I think you're not just, thinking about this moment, but I think responding in your work in real time to this moment. So I'm really excited, for audiences or for viewers to really get a sense of how you're kind of internalizing and thus producing in this moment as well. But as Christine said, you've been working in drawing and painting and sculpture and time-based media for a while. And you've taken on, I'm going to say it like that, and you've taken on, everything from racial, identity, subjectivity, ritual. But your recent work has really, as I mentioned, kind of responded more to police violence and to the pandemic in the events of the past few months. Can you walk us through what kind of, what you're thinking about and what the work looks like?
yeah, absolutely. I have to start by saying I'm still really unpacking Dr. Bath's talk about racism pornography. I realize that I am really deeply affected by that, and I seem to experience it almost every morning. It feels like I wake up to it. So I'm glad that she's talking about those kinds of issues, and Ava talking about the idea of responsibility and how artists relate to responsibility and our impact and the need to consider yourself responsible as opposed to consider the opportunity of making art. So I realize that I have far too many slides. I'm gonna have to go through them fairly quickly in order to touch on some of these things. But the image that you're looking at right now is from a body of work that I call Anxious Men. And I started this body of work in 2014. And in some ways it was a response to police violence. Actually, having started this body of work right after the shooting of Mike Brown and thinking about kind of the consequences of being Black on the street and your exposure to the police and the anxiety and the fear that comes with that experience and those experiences. And in a cathartic sense, I started taking material that I had worked with previously, in particular black soap and wax, and I started pouring it onto these tile background surfaces. And there are several reasons that I was kind of using that, and because of limitations of time, I can't really kind of dig into the entire purpose and some of the signifying tools. But I started kind of making these characters that I thought were real representations of my emotional state. And that state of anxiety was very much where I was and how I was feeling, just kind of a deep concern for how my body functioned in space and the potential damage that could be done my body in the confrontation with police officers. So these kind of hectic drawings were born of that time. That led to an exhibition in 2015 at the Drawing Center, and the image behind you is an image of my father. If you could get a close-up, which I don't have, you would see that behind him he has the autobiography of Malcolm X and a book called I Ching. He's also wearing a green belt, and I've always really enjoyed that image and thought that it was quite interesting because the green belt is not a particularly high belt in the process of getting to black in karate, which he was doing. And so, you know, thinking about employing that image and thinking about the fact that I was at the time and continue to be a father, but I was new to being a father around this time, and thinking about the responsibility that I had to discuss, sorry, my dog's here, to discuss with my son and to take him through the course of how to negotiate with a country that has an incredible set of racist antecedents and things that he's going to have to respond to. And honestly, the thing that concerned me most was that I had become accustomed to navigating a world that was deeply complicated. But the fact that I was going to have to translate that to another person was really, really complicated and difficult for me to swallow. And it kind of helped me led me into more of these kinds of pictures. So after having started really with the idea of these images as self-portraits, they evolved into these larger groups. And this is an example of one of those groups, as I was getting feedback that other people were feeling kind of similar sets and you know, similar feelings of anxiety and the way that they kind of were looking at my work and thinking about kind of the world that we're living in at the time. Next slide. So this brings us up to date, and I guess it kind of starts to talk about some of the things around COVID crisis and some of my more recent work, which really kind of in an aggressive way as far as mark making starts to address where we are and how I'm seeing the world. So, you know, in this particular image, you're looking at oil on canvas, which, you know, really digs into a classic kind of canonical narrative as far as materials are concerned, thinking about kind of the most classic ways of representing an art object using, you know, the material of oil. And I'm kind of digging into these kind of random aggressive gestures and marks, and that's kind of where the work is right now as far as kind of considering where we are.
Yeah. It's interesting that you bring up this use of material, because I would love to talk about how you use different materials and you use different rituals to really interrogate modes of healing, right? So there's the, you know, there's anxiety and there's a feeling of fear and confusion and anger, and then there's healing. And so I would love to kind of talk about how you, like I said, could use various materials to think through what healing could look like or the possibilities of healing.
Yeah, and in my work, it's interesting. I don't spend much time at the art supply store necessarily. I often find my materials in the world, and they're mostly signifiers and things that I've employed in the past and things that I use oftentimes on my body. So this is a work that I call Cosmic Slop, which is made of black soap. And black soap is a West African product that people often use who have quite sensitive skin. So it kind of functions as a metaphor for that sensitivity. And in it, you see a lot of aggressive mark making and gesturing and digging into the surface. And you kind of think about the physicality and the dance of how a work like this is made. But one of the things that I think you consider when looking at a work like this is that it is employable in multiple ways. It has a different sense of utility. You can wash yourself with this work, and that dichotomy, that two-ness that it inherently has is something that I think is really important to how my project functions. We can go to the next slide. And that's a detail.
This is a little bit of, but I'm curious to know how you, the use of abstraction, because there's the use of various materials, but there's also, you know, a very intentional decision to work abstractly. So can you talk about how abstraction kind of also factors into how you're dealing with this, you know, this type of material?
No, absolutely. You know, abstraction and improvisation, I think, are partners very much. And I came from a space where I was really interested in jazz music and really interested in early forms of abstraction and mark making and the physicality and the nature of being able to express oneself without a representative strategy.
Mhm.
And the physicality that allows your thoughts to kind of graduate into image. So abstraction and a lot of the heroes that I have as an artist came, employed abstract strategies, and those heroes include John Coltrane as much as they do Ed Clark or Franz Klein or Jackson Pollock. So I'm really a child of history and an artist really invested in kind of canonical narratives and reimagining how the canon is structured and who it belongs to. This is a work that, again, I think does touch on some of these concerns around healing. It has several different materials in it and live plants. One of the reasons that I wanted to show this work in particular is I often get really interesting questions when I exhibit something that has live plants in it. People often come to me and they say, who's gonna feed them? People will quite literally walk over a homeless man, go into the gallery, and they'll, in a very frustrated way, ask who's gonna water the plants. And I think what that does is it starts to kind of bring empathy into the space and the opportunity that these kind of natural materials, or these really quite familiar materials, inherently allow for empathy to enter the space, and the agency that we feel once empathy is there, it kind of deconstructs some of the walls that may be present in the exploration of an art object, when we often asking ourselves, what is this? How does it function? Why am I engaging with it? When you come across an object like this that's more familiar, you often have to say to yourself, I know what this object is. I know what these plants are. I know how they live in the world. And that familiarity, I think, makes people feel that they have a certain agency when they come into these spaces that are oftentimes less inviting for people of color. So that's a big pile of shea butter. And so for those who are familiar, shea butter is comes from a West African nut and is often used for application to the body for moisturizing, but it's also used for cooking. It has several different employable tools. And it's also something that I sculpt with. So it's a really kind of complicated material, but allows you to kind of think about the transatlantic kind of trade routes and how materials get to a place, and also makes you investigate our relationship to an Africanness while looking at materials. And it also has several healing properties, people imagine it.
So the last few years you've been working in film, or you're making film. How do you see film as speaking to your practice? How do you see it, or how does it function differently than something like a shea butter sculpture or, something else? I'd love to really understand what role, I guess, like I said, you see film playing in your practice.
Narrative is complicated. I really do like storytelling, and I like the potential for telling stories in film. I mean, I love what Ava does. My structures and some of the things that I've done previously, have not given me the kind of opportunity to reach a more broad audience oftentimes, like film, like film can capture. And to be able to kind of investigate those histories and tell stories, kind of really putting the body, and in particular in my projects, the Black body, into spaces is an opportunity that I really welcome. And I'm really excited about some projects that I'm considering moving forward. I'm moving really slowly in my relationship to film because I'm only interested in projects that are really quite specific to what I'd like to talk about. So I'm not coming into just direct random ideas, brought to me by others, but I'm still very excited about the medium. I think I have a 2-minute clip from from a short film that's more of an art film or art video shot in 8mm that I was gonna include, and let us watch that and then talk for a brief second on the other side.
And so I know we saw a short clip from The Hikers, but you also wanted to show us images from another film that you made.
Yeah, last year I made a film based on the book by Richard Wright, Native Son, and I worked with Suzan-Lori Parks to adapt it for screen and to contemporize that story. And it included the character that we all know, the protagonist, Bigger Thomas, but in the contemporary telling, we really kind of transform how he functions in the world, making him kind of a black punk and suggesting that his trajectory is quite a bit different than that of Wright's original character, kind of taking into account, but not pandering to some of what Baldwin's criticism was, and exploring the agency that this character kind of had. And that was really a pretty interesting experience. The Hikers, I wish that we had more time so I could show you the entire 7 minutes. It's quite a short film, but it's a film shot in Aspen, Colorado, with Claudia Schreier as the choreographer, with having been given the instruction to think about the black body moving in space when it's not being consumed, when it's not being witnessed. And this anxious mask and this kind of agoraphobic, kind of large outdoor space, and how that character then kind of negotiates that openness and losing some of the kind of rhythmic nature, or some of the more kind of traditional athletic movement strategy that we've become accustomed to in the way that we think about the black body in space. These two characters graduate towards one another, and they kind of have this incredible kind of exchange. It's not dissimilar from when Black folks often see each other in spaces to which there aren't very many Black folks, and there's this kind of moment of platonic love that comes as a result, this kind of imagining that you are together with someone like you, and that if something horrible were to happen, at least you have somebody there with you on your side. So that story is kind of told through a kind of loose knit narrative. And The Hikers. Native Son is a film that I made that was distributed by HBO, but it was a film that opened the Sundance Film Festival, which was really an exciting experience as well.
So speaking of platonic love and being amongst people that, you know, not only look like us, but I think are very committed to the same things, I would love to call back the panelists to just give in. I'm just kind of looking at the time and make sure that we have an opportunity to engage in a conversation. And I'm sure, Ava will join when she's available. But it seems like, going a little off script here, but it seems like, what Erica was saying about, trauma porn really kind of resonated both with Rashid and I know with many, I can see Darnell kind of shaking his head and just kind of talking about how on one level, you don't want to view these, you're like, okay, I can't take another video. I can't take another image. I can't, but you almost can't look away, right? Like you're kind of drawn to looking at this work. So can you talk about, I guess a little bit more, and maybe Erica could kick it off, but just about like kind of the anger, the angst, the damage to self-esteem that's caused to Black people when we are constantly kind of seeing this video content. And I just want to say that I really want this to be a conversation. So if Ava, you want to jump in, girl, just like, just go in there. Please do not wait on me to call on you, or if Rashid, there's something in particular that Erica mentioned, but just to kind of kick it off, since it seems that term really seemed to kind of resonate with a few of our panelists.
I think what I was trying to convey is that we are saturated with images of seeing Black bodies being beaten, killed in so many different ways. And we do need to document and own and tell our stories. And I think one of the things that the panelists brought up, which is important, it's like who's controlling the narrative, right? But I worry about the frequency and omnipresence of certain types of images, which are often not controlled by, Black and brown hands that we're seeing, and how that impacts on the brain. So seeing, violence, there's a reason why certain movies are, rated R or NC-17. And there's a reason why certain violent imagery, even, after September 11th, people who are watching the buildings being falling down, they had more trauma-like experiences. And so these images can be traumatic, and there's a salaciousness and spectatorship to the ways in which they're being consumed by media.
The thing that really captured me about the idea of racism porn was actually not so much the trauma porn aspect, but really kind of, and I guess this is quite personal, but I wake up in the morning and I kind of look for a Karen. I find satisfaction in it. And some of these, like I'm oftentimes looking for these moments, right? That really more or less say to me, I am not alone in this experience. And I wonder for Erica, if this is kind of a different position, when I look to see a Black person experiencing racism via video footage and kind of potentially even fighting back are helping me understand from that location that I am not alone in these experiences. And that's kind of more what I was suggesting was interesting about racism pornography.
Yeah, well, I think that's an affirmative, position, right? So if you're seeing, I think we see these images and then there's no justice, no peace, right? So we're seeing these images and then we're seeing, society sort of ignoring them. But it's very different what you're describing, and sort of it's almost like you're seeing things in a way that people are acting appropriately. It's more empowering to see someone calling out, like to see, I forget the name of Mr. Cooper, who was accused of bird watching by Amy Cooper. But it was very affirming for me as well to see how he handled it, how he turned the camera in the other direction. And so we need that. But I think there's this sort of juxtaposition in where, CNN showing George Floyd's the knee on the neck over and over in all these different ways. Like, I wonder if there should be a cap. And I don't have the answer, but I do know that seeing that collectively does affect our mental health. It affects, people have been actually studying this and demonstrating this scientifically. And so how do we disrupt that? Part of it is telling our own stories, right?
Yeah, from my point of view, I think for me at least, it goes back to this question of control. When I think of Emmett Till, for example, and the fact that his mother, insisted that the body be shown because she wanted the world to see the brutality of what happened to him. She was in control. She had agency. She decided she wanted to make that point. What the media did with it after that, of course, she didn't control completely, but that was a calculation. It was a risk she was willing to take for the greater good. In the same way that protesters, for example, take to the streets in the middle of a pandemic and risk being infected. So, there's risks with everything, I think. But for me, it comes back to control. It comes back to intention and what it is we're trying to achieve with the image. And all too often, unfortunately, we don't control the image. And I think that's when we lapse into the type of pornography that you're talking about, where, it's often, numbing and counterproductive in terms of the way it's circulated.
You, this was referenced actually in an interview with Ava, but, talking about, the latest conversations around, which are certainly not new, but just have gained, I think, more traction around defunding the police. And you talked about in an interview that I was watching around, really reevaluating, obviously, our police system and our jail system as well. Can you talk, for those who aren't as familiar, can you talk about the initiatives around, or the ideas around defunding the police, and just how in your work and the amount of work that you've done, have you evolved, I guess, in your understanding of, I'm also kind of weaving in questions from the audience. So just as an FYI, so these are both my questions, but also I'm they're feeding me questions on the side. So folks are really kind of interested in, Ava, in hearing your ideas or your thoughts around kind of like good cops, bad cops, but then also this idea around defunding the police and your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, defunding the police is I think folks are just encountering the term and the last couple of months, and it seems like a lot to reckon with. Not new. This is a call from, folks that are working around mass criminalization for decades. I consider myself a prison abolitionist, a step to the left of defunding. But defunding is a step towards that. The idea that, there's a new dream about what public safety could be, and that it doesn't require, people with guns to show up at every part of American life, and that we can reimagine what that is. Defunding the police is a step towards that. So when people, it's interesting, I was talking to a very high profile friend, not Oprah, because everybody always thinks it's her right off, not her. Okay.
More than one friend, but yes.
Another high profile friend who was very much struggling with defund the police. And in my mind, defund the police is like a step back from, a step closer to the middle than abolishing the police. But to see people reacting so out of a place of fear.
I think it's fear
about the idea. And so I just ask people, when the term first started to be introduced to people who were not aware of it, it sounded very scary and violent for the police. But I just invite people to really look into what it is. I mean, it's really saying, aren't there better, more humane ways to deal with parts of our life, our community life, than having a cop show up for a disturbance, for a homeless person who might be standing in the wrong place, for a mental health issue, for whatever it may be, and to end schools, on film sets. Yeah. There's no reason for me to have an armed officer assist my crew through a red light when I'm shooting a car scene. It's just not necessary. Give me someone from traffic control. Like this doesn't match up. Those cops should be reserved to do their jobs, to have the right training, and to be doing their jobs in the right way. Don't put them in places where they don't need to be. So that's what the idea is. And the idea about good cops and bad cops is just like good people and bad people. I mean, certainly with LEAP, the Law Enforcement Accountability Project, and any of the things that we're talking about, whether it's When They See Us, I'm speaking about specific bad actors. And I don't believe that that's all police officers. But I do believe that this is a system. This is not about individuals. This is a system that is diseased at its core. It was built to be this way. This country was stolen by white people for white people in the pursuit of power and profit. I'm sorry, my friends, it's just the facts. And so every system, the healthcare system, the education system, the criminal justice system, the entertainment production system, all of those systems are built on top of that foundation. And so we can keep talking about individuals. I think that's something that we should really do as it comes to the police and calling out individuals. But overall, we have to keep our eye on the ball, the system. And that's what defunding the police asks us to do, interrogate the system.
One of the things we haven't necessarily spent a lot of time talking about, but I know is obviously very important, is talking about gender and sexuality biases as it relates to victims of police brutality. Can you, and I kind of put a pin in that conversation, Darnell, at the end of our conversation. So anyone obviously is welcome to answer it, but just how, what role, I guess, has media played in kind of perpetuating the silencing of Black women and trans folks as well, as it relates to police brutality, state-sanctioned violence? How has gender now entered this conversation in a way that it hadn't previously?
Yeah, well, I think that the general media response to LGBTQ issues kind of parallels societal relations to those different groups. And the fact that groups have been marginalized, they've been made invisible. At the same time, they've been targeted by police. And often that victimization has been unreported or underreported. Until recently, we hadn't seen a lot in terms of storytelling and narratives in Hollywood. You take a show like Pose, for example, which is a couple of years old now, which has actually dramatized some of those realities. We need to see a lot more of it. What tends to happen is that as you become more familiar with those types of images, awareness rises, and then the discourse around what that means and what we need to do to alleviate the problems becomes more prominent. And we aren't where we need to be with that, but we moved ahead of where we were just a few years ago when no one was talking about this in a very public way.
I think we have time for one more quick question before we have to say farewell.
I'm trying to think, oh God, it's like the pressure to think about one question. I guess a lot of people have been asking just about next steps. I mean, I think people are, we have folks kind of chiming in from Minnesota, from Brazil, from all over the world, really just thinking about what can they do in their own communities, but also what do next steps look like? I mean, not in terms of like for the rest of our lives, but just in terms of what can they do in their own communities? What can people do to kind of keep this conversation going? What can, on the health side, on the film and media side, like what do next steps look like? So I would love actually if each panelist could just briefly kind of just give some recommendations or to give some thoughts on what next steps could look like as it relates to this conversation. Okay, Darnell, I'm going to call on you because because I can.
Well, I think it goes back to, I'm speaking as a sociologist now, it goes back to social structures, it goes back to systems, it goes back to understanding how these processes work and not focusing solely on individuals, which is what we have been sort of socialized to do. So racism is a concept that many people are just coming to terms with now because of the recent protests. They're understanding that something was wrong. I mean, we've seen a pretty sizable shift here in the last few weeks, just in terms of public opinion and how people are thinking about these things. Now, I think the challenge is to keep the movement going, to breathe life into it, to figure out ways to build coalitions, between groups that had previously been divided and separated, as part of a grand strategy to divide and conquer, because as Ava pointed out earlier, I mean, this is what this country is. This is what this country has always been. And if we can imagine a better America, a better country, then it's going to require all of us to sort of come together and root out the structures that lead to police brutality and all these other structures that are in place that limit our opportunities and challenge our life chances.
Well, I love what the doctor said. Hi, Doc. And I think we got two docs here. Hi, Doc. But two doctors and two filmmakers. Rashid, what are we doing in here with these smart people?
All right.
But I think for me, I just try to, you know, there's no one answer to that, but I'm asked it often after I show 13th or some, or when they see us, or Wrinkles, anything, Queen Sugar, what do we do now? And, you know, for me, I think it's just about mindfulness, because everyone's in a different place. So what I'm going to ask, you know, you to do is different. What I'm going to think of, maybe something that you can do. You know where your mind's at. You know where your heart's at. You know where you live. You know what your family is. You know where your neighbors are. You know if you've never read a book about this. You know if you follow no Black people on Twitter, know no Black people in real life, none have come into your house. You just don't know us. You know if you see George Floyd and are really, you know, think that was wrong, but, you know, don't have a real connection to someone who's not like you, and don't have a real idea of the context for what you're seeing. And you also know that if you have a certain amount of information and awareness about those things, that there's further to go. That once you have that baseline of info, that you can get into the street, that you can have direct action. That doesn't always mean being at the protest, and, you know, but it also doesn't just mean giving money online. It means, you know, speaking up when you hear that something's wrong, when that joke that doesn't quite hit right, and you know it's wrong, say something. You know, take a risk to you know, correct someone if they're you know, injuring someone else. Even in words, especially in words. And so all that goes back to mindfulness for me. If you are in a mind state that you want to combat this, if you can accept where we are, then figure out what you can do where you are to end it. And that means you have to do a little work. Someone's not just gonna look at it, give you a list or a paint by numbers, because it's all different. You're gonna have to think about it. You're gonna have to figure it out for yourself, right? You're gonna have to calculate and do the personal math of what it takes for you to be accountable to yourself in this moment and be mindful. So that's what I invite people to do. There's no one way.
I would love to jump in right there, and I'm curious to know what Erica thinks about this. I think about a great article that Elizabeth Alexander, the poet and scholar I quoted from earlier, wrote in the New Yorker called The Trayvon Generation. And she refers to the Trayvon generation as about 25 and younger. And I think about this younger generation. One of my daughters is mixed Black. And I think about kind of the era that she's growing up in. And I think about this article by Elizabeth Alexander specifically, where she says that in this generation, that there are characters that we have in the media. Issa from Insecure, you know, kind of, or Earn and Van from Atlanta, and ask these questions that go a bit deeper around the storylines, such as, well, why did Earn really drop out of Princeton? Why did Van get high before the job interview? Why is Molly from Insecure in and out of therapy? You know, I think then there's Nathan, who's bipolar, and the kind of host of mental illness that that either we see directly as in Nathan's character or indirectly. And she's asking the question, Elizabeth Alexander, in this article around depression, and if it's, I don't want to say misdiagnosed, that's too strong a word, but there's this whole generation is suffering from a kind of intensity of emotion that is very much attached to their generation, and all the body cam footage, you know, all of this, the bystander footage, etc., that they're exposed to. Of course, you know, they're younger and younger on social media and seeing all of this. And so in terms of going forward from now and thinking about the younger generations, Erica, you work with kids in the foster system, the juvenile system, et cetera, like how this is really impacting them and how we can, you know, sort of collectively think about them. I think Frederick Douglass once said it's easier to to raise strong children than to repair broken men. I don't know if I have that quote exactly right, but along those lines. And so I just wanted to throw that out there, make that comment and ask a question as well. Thank you.
Thanks. So I think it's hard parenting in a pandemic and when everyone's finally waking up to racism. I do think we need to, like Ava said, to be mindful and continue to have deliberate, intentional, and reflective conversations. I think where people are in their lives, they need to be able to work on dismantling structures. So as a physician with the privileged positionality that I have and working in juvenile justice, what are my efforts to decarcerate young people, right? So that they're not in these structures that are dehumanizing them. I think white people have to do a lot of work, and that is going to require being reflective and seeing how white supremacy also affects them. And so those are some things that I would think about.
I don't know if anyone wants to give a final word or comment about everything, or about anything, but I think that we need to close our panel. I first and foremost want to thank these brilliant panelists. It was so incredible to have you on our virtual stage convening on this particular topic. Your words, your thoughts, your reflections, and all the work that you do are so important. So thank you very much. Thank you, Naima, Cello, Ellie, Kat, Connor, everyone behind the scenes. It took a lot of people to make this happen. We had thousands of people signing on. I am so grateful, and we continue to do the work that we do. Thank you and good night.